Hello and welcome to the Yoga Inquiry Project. I'm Jocela Crawford. Joining me today is Amy Cooper from Mount Shasta, California. You can find her at amycooperyoga.com. In today's episode, we're going to be exploring downward facing dog.
It's a forward bend. Downward dog is a forward bend. It's a spinal extension and it's an inversion. So those are the three things. And then through those three things, we can break that down further and go, downward dog requires hip flexion. What does that mean? Where are the restrictions? How do we then do it meeting our restrictions? And then the spinal extension piece is what needs to be freed up and or working in order to extend your spine, freeing up maybe the front of the spine and strengthening your extensor muscles in your spine. And then the inversion really brings us to the upper body, the shoulders, the wrists, what's happening in the shoulders and the wrists. So it's like, breakdown. And then of course there's the breath, which is part of the inversion, how we have to breathe differently and strengthen our diaphragm through being in a different relationship to gravity. It's simple.
It's simple. It's just these three things, just a forward fold, right? Just a spinal extension. And what was the third thing? Now I forgot.
Inversion.
An inversion, right?
Yeah. So let's just hamstrings and we'll stay with our sort of plan. Sure. But I think, also what's interesting about downward dog, that is, if we're talking about somebody fresh coming into it, is that you're weight bearing on your hands. Like that's really the big wow about downward dog. Because when in life are we weight bearing on our hands unless we're getting down on the ground to get something or converse with our animals or our children?
Yes.
So, anyway, it's hard to focus just on one thing is what I was last night. And so I was like, wow, and they're so interrelated. So how do we compartmentalize? I'm not really going to be able to do that, but I'll do the best I can.
So then, Amy, what were those three main things? If you can't quite compartmentalize, can we give them little titles? What were those three main things?
Forward bend, obviously. I was like, well, what is downward dog? Downward dog is a forward bend, which will then need to address hamstring restriction and maybe hip flexor weakness. Spinal extension, right? So you've got it's a hip flexor forward bend at play. And certainly one of the main ways in which we flex in downward dog at the hips is through the grounding, which would be an up and back action when you're inverted in downward dog of the heads of the thigh bones into the hip socket. So if there's a lot of restriction around the hips and you can't get the heads of the femurs, the thigh bones, into the kind of center of the joint where they can move freely and then it's going to be difficult to do it in downward dog when you're working against gravity.
So what you were talking about, there's a lifting sensation. Can you talk more about that as I fold?
The heads of the thigh bones actually are going to be moving back.
Backwards.
Yeah, back to be a more of a vertical, stable feature from which the pelvis then can rotate. Right.
Pressing those back and doing a supported forward fold, so lifting up the floor, bringing the floor to you.
Yes.
And taking the forward fold. And so kind of exploring that forward fold motion, like you said, without so much gravity.
Yes. And that's a gentle way of kind of exploring at what point the pelvis stops rotating forward, where the hamstrings are going to be at their maximum length. So having your hands elevated on a chair or a coffee table or a ledge of any sort is really a good way to then kind of assess that before you have to work against gravity.
But in the femurs moving back, there can often be so much of a collapsing here. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about the angle of the pelvis?
Right.
What are we trying to attain, if you will? The angle of the pelvis in a forward fold, and maybe as we work a little bit towards the downward facing dog. Obviously, this is too much arch for the spine. I'm not getting the spinal extension. So where does the angle of the pelvis interact with the spinal extension piece?
Yeah. Well, the only way to really extend the spine is to forward rotate the pelvis around the
Okay.
body, right? So that anterior forward tilt of the pelvis is how we extend the spine. Going back, very common, cue for coming into downward dog, whether you're a new student or a more experienced student. I like to bend my knees every time I come in, but it is where people are going to free up that that kind of restricted, where I was suggesting how when you did just the forward fold using the chair, it enabled you or a student or someone to then assess at what point the hamstrings are too tight to allow the pelvis to tip forward. So at that point, back up, come out of the pose, take an inhale, bend the knees, and then allow that bending of the knees will free up the pull on the hamstrings to a certain extent to allow for more freedom in that hinging action, and then more freedom into the spine to extend.
So let's recap that, Amy. If a person their downward facing dog looks more like this,
more hunched in the upper body.
More hunched in the upper body. We don't necessarily have to change the upper body too much. Certainly raising the floor absolutely helps. Yes. But actually the bend of the knees, like you said, will take it out of the hamstrings a bit and allow for more of the fold in the pelvis.
Yes.
And maybe then a little more freedom for the spine.
Yes. So just to say, even if we were to go step by step, let's just say I'm going to raise my hands up. They'll raise the floor up with some blocks for this demo, but to feel into the capped as a way, because your knees are bent, so you can free up that forward tilt of the pelvis here to extend the spine, and then maintaining that coming into the pose so that that translates from one to the other. Now, if you then were to straighten the legs, you could see if my hamstrings are tight, that I'm going to send my weight forward and begin to hunch my upper body.
Yes.
Bending the knees, I can pivot the pelvis and extend the spine. So definitely, it makes a huge difference.
It does.
Yeah.
So and restriction, it's amazing how the restriction in their upper body, how that translates in a yoga pose to the lower part of the body. And in this case, the inability to shift your body weight from forward to back.
Yes. Yeah. We get, when the hamstrings are tight, really tightened down, which is many of us, the pelvis was going to posterior tilt, then the spine goes into flexion, our weight is sent over. That's where, again, grounding the thigh tops in downward dog, it would be up and back, because, you're more inverted than the forward bend that you did earlier. So yes, getting that action of forward tilt comes also with the thighs grounding back, and that's going to allow your weight to lift off your upper body and free up your upper body. So, and again, then the breath is going to be more free and will be more.
Do you want us to breathe while we're doing this pose? Okay, so that's part of it.
Yeah. So that might be a good, this might be enough for just right now as taking this.
So elevating, the briefest recap.
Yeah.
For some tight upper body experience where someone feels restriction. First step could be elevating the front of the body, the hands. So that could be blocks, chair, wall.
Yes.
To experience more of the forward fold, to then experience more of the spinal extension, to then experience more of the inversion, which are those three components that you had talked about, downward facing dog.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
we figured it out.
Yeah,
and we figured it out, Amy.
We're going to address that affects the rest of the posture and our sense of ease. And it's a wonderful, rich exploration and inquiry. So
Yes. Well, thank you, Amy. And where can people find you, Amy, if they want to learn more specifically what you're offering?
yeah, amycooperyoga.com.
Great.
Yeah.
We will see you next week here from the Crawford Wellness to Mount Shasta, California, my hometown. Thanks, Amy, for sharing your wisdom and helping us get to achieve some form of downward facing dog, even if our hamstrings